So today we're going to focus on the economy in the interwar years. For Unit 7, we started with World War One. We talked about the causes of World War One and we talked about how the war was conducted. We also touched on challenges to the existing political order through four revolutions that we see in Russia, China, Mexico, and then also the decline and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now we're looking at this period of time from 1919 to 1939, and we're going to focus on the economic challenges of that period of time. So the basic idea is that World War One created the conditions for a great deal of economic challenges that the world will have to face. What you have to understand is that we're entering a new stage of history where an industrial world is playing by different rules than the world before industrialization. The problem is that not a lot of people are keeping up and are aware of the consequences of this new world and the new way of doing business. So we're going to see a significant number of economic problems develop in the 1920s and the 1930s that is going to change the role of government. So that's what we're really looking at through this whole process. So first, we want to look at the economic challenges after World War One ends in 1919. And we can look at Britain and France and see challenges developing there. The challenges for Britain and France stem from the fact that a number of their male population had perished in World War One. And while there's an emotional context to that loss, there's a generation that grows up having lost brothers, having lost fathers, having lost husbands, having lost friends, and that impacts the cultural, artistic, and literature or literary development of that world. There's also economic damage done in that now there's a source of cheap labor that is no longer available. And there's also customers no longer available. So what that does is it suppresses demand for products because there's just not as many people out there to buy stuff. And it also suppresses the supply of cheap labor, which is going to lead to a reduction of production. Hey, that rhymes. So that's one way there is a challenge created by World War One. The second way was the amount of debt Britain and France assumed because of paying for the war. This war was not expected to go on for 4 years. This war was not expected to cost this much. And England and France had to borrow excessively in order to keep the war going. And the way they funded that war was largely through borrowing money from the United States. And for the United States, this is a big moment because we turn into a creditor nation. We're lending money out at a much higher volume than we're borrowing money. And I know in today's world, we're kind of the flip. We're a huge debtor nation. And we still do lend out money. It gets confusing. But suffice it to say, Britain and France have to pay this money back to the United States. That creates another economic challenge because here's this demand to pay back an excessive amount of money. And that's going to cripple an economy and it's going to hold an economy back from growing. And then the third thing is that for Britain and France, they were counting on the German reparations to help them pay back the United States. The problem that we'll see in a second is that the German economy is struggling so much that they can't make the reparation payments reliably. So for Britain and France, they were counting on those reparation payments. And while they are collecting a little bit of the reparations, it's only a fraction of what they were counting on. And they were counting on using those reparation payments to pay back the United States. So what's happening in the 1920s is that the economic fate of Germany, England, France, and the United States are all tied together through reparations. And if somewhere along the process something breaks down, everybody suffers. And that's a big part of this economic development is that the global economy is more and more interconnected. Yet we have countries who insist on thinking only within their own borders. That brings me to Germany. Germany, their economy was very limited by reparations. So any economic growth that Germany might experience would be sucked out through the reparation repayments. And this is going to act as a ball and chain on the German economic development. The second thing is that Germany also ran up an excessive war debt. But the big problem for Germany was that they were counting on winning that war. If they had won the war, the resources they would have collected would have paid off the war debt. They didn't win the war, so now they've got debt on top of reparations. So this creates a huge anchor on the German economy. And to simplify things, one of the ways of dealing with demands on the government was to print more money. And that's going to lead to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. Essentially, the German government, which is the Weimar Republic at this point, the German government is going to pay its obligations by printing more money. But of course, as you print more money, the money becomes worth less. And you got to a point where the German mark, which was the currency of the time, was not even worth the paper that it was printed on. You could have, I believe, $1 could be exchanged for well over 2 trillion marks, which shows you just how worthless the value of the money had become. This creates a great deal of confusion and chaos within the German economy. And that hyperinflation crisis is just an indication of the economic challenges Germany faces in the 1920s. Now, if we go over to the Soviet Union, which we should remember has become a communist state after the Bolshevik uprising of 1970. So, just to review, the Soviet Union is born out of Russia. Russia experiences a revolution in the middle of World War One. The Bolsheviks eventually take over. The Bolsheviks take the Russia out of World War One, but an anti-Bolshevik coalition rises up. And from 1918 to 1920, there is a Russian civil war. So Russia goes out of World War One through a revolution into a civil war where the Bolsheviks are fighting against a coalition of anti-Bolshevik supporters. So the anti-Bolshevik crowd enlisted the help from the United States, from Britain, from France, from Japan to come in and stamp out the communist uprising. So from 1918 to 1920, there is a significant civil war that costs even more lives and creates more damage. During this time, the Bolsheviks will increase their power over the state, putting into place what's called war communism. And what the Bolsheviks will do is take what they need to sustain themselves during the Civil War. In the end, the Bolsheviks win, but the Bolsheviks are now tasked with governing the Soviet Union. And one of the biggest problems are the war debts that the Russian government had accumulated during World War One. So now we have a new government that's taking over in Russia. And one of the first decisions is that the Bolsheviks repudiate the debts. They basically cancel the war debts that they owe to France. France was the biggest one. So that cripples France's plans for paying back the United States even more. So what you're ending up with is the Bolsheviks, now the Communist Party, simply washing their hands of any war debt that they had. Second, the Civil War and the revolution in World War One had created significant damage to the Russian economy. It depressed their production. And if you take a look at the graph on your right, you'll see that those blue dots represent Russian GDP. And then all of a sudden, if you take a look at, let me see if I can figure this out, between 1915 and 1925, we have this huge drop. It's like the bottom just falls right out. And that drop is what we're talking about at this time. And if I showed you other countries' graphs of GDP, we'll see a similar trend. Maybe not that dramatic, but we'll see a similar trend where from about 1918 to about 1925, there's this decline in productivity and GDP. Then after 25 to 1929, we'll see an increase. So we take a look at the last group that's going to be affected, the colonies. So of course, if England, France, and Germany, and even the United States are struggling with post-war recession, The colonies are going to feel it even more because we've learned that their economies are so reliant on the British, the French, the Germans, and the United States. So if you're a Latin American economy, that's an export based economy, and your number one customer is not purchasing the same level of copper and tin and beef and guano that was harvested from Latin America, then your economy is going to be hurt badly because your economy centers so much around the industrial powers purchasing from you. And that's going to happen to cash crop plantations all throughout the colonies. It's going to hit Indonesian colonies. It's going to hit African colonies. This is going to be felt across the globe. So the first thing that we want to realize is that from 1919 till about 1925, there is this economic drag, this decline in global productivity. And it's not limited to just one country. It's global. It's affecting the colonies, it's affecting the industrial estates in very different ways. And then the kicker from 1925 to 1929, we see a rebound. And in US history, we often refer to this as the roaring 20s, where times are good. In reality, it was the later half of the 1920s that were really good times. The economy is starting to recover across the board, but there's still fundamental problems that will lead to the Great Depression. So the Great Depression starts in 1929. And what you could essentially argue is that it continues through till World War II begins. Because once World War II begins and gets ramped up, the demand for productivity increases. That fixes a lot of the problems. So if you're ever asked what solved the Great Depression, the answer is World War II. But when the Great Depression happened, there's a lot of pressure to get involved in fixing things then. So we're going to talk about that. The first thing, what caused the Great Depression? We don't want to get too bogged down in details. So what we will say is that the U.S. economy was a linchpin to a lot of European businesses and a lot of the global economy. So when the US economy collapsed in 1929, and the collapse for the US economy can be attributed to overproduction of industrial and agricultural goods. It can be attributed to speculation in the stock market. It can be attributed to um, poor regulation of the financial industry. There's a number of causes that we can get into. Suffices to say, the US economy collapses. And when the US economy collapsed, a lot of European economies began to collapse too. For example, in Germany, there were German businesses which were depending on borrowing money from American banks. When the American banks go under, those German businesses have to close. Those German businesses, of course, employ people. Those people are out of jobs now. And then once they're out of jobs, there's a decline in the demand for manufactured goods, which leads to a ripple effect of other industries shutting down. You don't need to get overly involved with what caused the Great Depression for us. You just need to know it happened for right now. But what made this worse, and this is something you need to know, is the protectionist policies of nations. So the economy of the globe is interconnected by this point. What happens in the United States has an impact on European countries. And what happens to European countries has an impact on all the various colonies throughout the world. However, there is still a mindset of countries taking care of themselves first, putting up tariffs to limit foreign imports, to put in policies to protect the economic interest of one country with by eliminating interaction with the other countries. So if you take a look at the graph on the right, you will see that from 1926 to 1929, we have this world production going up. It goes from whatever that unit of 80 is to 100. And then right at 1929 to 1932, 33, we see this huge drop. And that huge drop represents the Great Depression. And then you see the world production start going back up. and as we get closer to World War II and things of that nature. And that's going to relate to a variety of things, which we'll talk about in a second. But look at the drop of the world trade. The world trade is going to go right along with the world production. And then during the Great Depression, it drops right with the world production. But then as production recovers, trade does not recover the same way. And that's a reference to the protectionist policies that are being put in. Now, that brings me to the faith in the economic cycle. Another cause to this is that when the Great Depression happened, the attitude was let it play itself out, it will correct itself in the long run. So the idea is that the laissez faire attitude said, let it play out, don't do anything about it. It's correcting itself, it needs to correct itself, you need to give it time. And that attitude of being hands off actually created a worse situation because the problems actually ended up getting worse. And that puts a pressure on the people. And we'll talk about that in 2 minutes. Now we come to the effects of the Great Depression. First of all, the decline of global trade by about 40% is something significant. And that is really going to impact those colonies that I had referred to. A colony that relied on exporting is going to be devastated. There are going to be some colonies where 90% of their economy is just wiped out because their economy centers around the production of one or two cash crops. Those things aren't being purchased, and that completely collapses their economy. Second, in industrialized states, there is going to be an increase in unemployment. And this is going to bring us to a very important feature. What starts to happen is obviously with unemployment comes economic hardship. And that's something we can all wrap our heads around. But the other thing is that it starts to lead to the questioning of capitalist theories. So the 19th century was laissez-faire time. It was the time of capitalism. Whether you're in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, capitalism reigned supreme. Then after World War I, capitalism doesn't seem to be providing the answers. So what happens is that the Great Depression will cause people to question whether or not capitalism is really the best economic system out there. And that challenge to capitalism is going to lead us to the next thing: increase government involvement in the economy. The government will start to regulate and be involved in the economy more than ever before. In your notes, you want to star this point because this is the big point, is that because of economic challenges, the government will assume more responsibility for the economy. Think about our society today. We constantly look to the presidents to to support a growing economy or to make things more economically equitable amongst the population. All ships rising together. That idea that the government bears that type of responsibility grows out of this period of time of the 1920s and 1930s. And that is the big thing you want to take away from this lecture. And that brings me to how is government going to be involved? And that's Keynesian economics. So there's an economist named Keynes, Keynes. And what Keynes said was that, well, you're right. In the long run, the economic system will fix itself. But for human beings, in the long run, we're all dead. So if you just wait it out, yes, eventually it will fix it, but there will be a lot of suffering in the meantime. And if the government is willing to get involved, we can alleviate that suffering from the economic depressions that come with the economic cycle. So, what Keynes produced or proposed was that governments should spend money to make up for the decline of productivity. So, if an economy is generating a certain amount of wealth and generating a certain amount of activity, and that activity drops, then what the government should do is fill in the hole that's been created. And the way they would do that is through borrowing money or deficit spending. And this is also referred to as priming the pump. You go back to the old days before we could just turn a faucet and get water. you had to get water from a pump. So you go to a pump, you start cranking on the pump. But if you don't have anything in that pump to begin with, if you don't have a little bit of water in the pump, you're going to come up dry. So what you have to do is pour a little water into the pump, and that will start drawing the water up. So what Keynes was producing, what was proposing, was that the government should find ways to get money into the economy, and then the economy would kind of take off on its own. And then once the economy got going, the government could back off, and then the government could pay off the debt. And if you're looking at this going, wow, that sounds awfully familiar when you look at the COVID-19 stimulus plans, when you look at the government just sending checks out to people, that is Keynesian economics at work. And what they're trying to do is push money into the system to get the system going again, priming the pump. But the idea, the downside to all of this is that at some point you got to pay off the debt. And what Keynes said is you do it when times are good. Of course, you can look at what has happened where we haven't exactly done that. So we'll be talking about that as we go through this unit. Our last section are examples of government involvement. So how does the government involve itself in the economy? Well, actually, there's two more slides. This is the last Roman numeral. First, there's a socialist communist approach. So the socialist communist approach, to sum it up, is where the government starts taking control of the means of production and redistributes that amongst the people in a way to solve the problems that they're facing. Now, some socialism is not harsh authoritarian socialism. Others involve harsh authoritarian tactics. So realize that when I say socialism and communism, I'm talking about an alternative to the capitalist system. The capitalist approach is leave everything in the private hands of people and they will figure it out. The socialist communist approach says take some and or all of the means of production and put it into the central government's hands and then let the central government distribute as they see fit. And you can have everything in between too. So in our case, we look at the United States and we see the New Deal. And the New Deal is a form of socialism because what it is doing is taking government money, which is generated by tax revenue, and is redistributing it to the population. And this approach was, with the hope of the New Deal, was that by the government basically hiring people out, beginning huge jobs programs where people would work for the US government and the government would pay these people, they would start demanding manufactured goods and private enterprises would respond by increasing productivity. When the businesses responded, they would start hiring workers. And once workers started getting back to work, they would have money in their pocket from their wages and they would start demanding, more production, and which would just keep leading to economic growth. So in the New Deal, the idea was to use a socialist approach to stimulate a capitalist system, a private market system. And the New Deal, there is debate whether or not the New Deal had any effect. There are people who say the New Deal was the way we got through the Great Depression. There's other people who say the New Deal really didn't do anything. World War II did it all. And most of the time, we do agree with the idea that the Great Depression for the US ends with World War II. Because World War II, there is a demand for, more workers, and that led to more wages, and that just increased our productivity. So, did the New Deal actually fix things? That's a hotly debated topic. But it represents an increased role of the US government in the economy. The Soviet Union represents a much harsher involvement. In other words, the US did what they did, but they weren't throwing people in jail for protesting or voting against the system. The Soviet Union, they will go there. So the Soviet Union, as you remember, is suffering from an economic collapse because of World War One, the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Civil War. And what Lenin proposed was to ease up on communist restrictions, to kind of back off on the communist restrictions on production. and allow private production at a very low scale to take place. And that's called the new economic plan. And if you go back, you can see, sorry, I'll go back, where this red line starts jumping up. That's partly due to the new economic plan. So the new economic plan was Lenin's solution, but Lenin dies. And in his place comes Joseph Stalin. And what Stalin proposed was a government directed effort at industrializing. So he put out the 5 year plans, and the 5 year plans set up goals of industrial production. And the expectation is that workers would reach this industrial production, or they would get shipped off to labor camps called gulags. So the punishment for falling short on the 5 year plans was significant. And we call these objectives quotas. So the idea is that Stalin would say, I want 20 million tons of steel produced by this day. So the steel factories would start working to try and meet that quota. And if the quota wasn't met, somebody was going to be held responsible. And that's actually, interestingly enough, why we can't really trust the documents about productivity. Because if you're a factory supervisor, you're responsible for a certain amount of steel being produced within a certain month, and you fall short of that, you're going to falsify data. You are going to lie through your teeth, because if you lie and get caught, you get sent to the gulag. If you don't meet the quota, you get sent to the gulag. So which would you rather do? And if you're a supervisor of that factory supervisor and that lie gets through you, you're not throwing that guy under the bus, because then you'll get shipped off to the gulag. And if you're the communist official making sure these factories are producing and your job is on the line, you're going to make sure that things look right on paper. So you have to be careful when people say, look, the 5 year plans were really successful. We really don't know. We know that Russia did industrialize in terms of productivity. However, we don't know how much, because there's a strong incentive to lie in this stuff. The other part of the 5 years plan was the collectivization piece. And collectivization is where Stalin seized control of the farmland. So if you remember, one of the big issues through history is land redistribution. Peasants want land. Stalin is going to take that land and he's going to say, you have to farm. We're going to take the food from you and we're going to send it to the factory workers in the city to support our 5 year plans. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of peasants who resist this. The peasants reject this. And a conflict takes place between the government and the farmers. A famine is going to ensue because farmers are destroying, they would rather slaughter their cattle than hand it over to the government. They would rather destroy farm machines than do the work for the government. And Stalin is going to start arresting people, shooting people, imprisoning people, sending them to gulags, sending them to Siberia. And there's going to be a violent political oppression that's going on in response to this. A famine will result that will have a significant impact throughout the Russian population. Millions are going to die because of these policies. And then lastly, we go to Mexico. So we've been talking about the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And a new political party forms called the International Revolution Party, or the PRI, which I imagine is the Spanish version of the word, the initials of the Spanish version. And the PRI is going to emerge as a party dedicated to preserving the ideals and goals of the revolution. And to them, they see themselves as the successors to the revolutionary movement. In the 1920s, 1930s, they're going to start solidifying control of Mexican politics. And throughout the 1940s, they're going to be the only party kind of doing the governing of Mexico, all the way up to like within the past 20 years. The PRI is going to get involved in the economy by nationalizing the oil industry. The oil industry had been under the control of foreign investors. Now the PRI is going to take that away from the foreign investors and they're going to create a government run oil industry with the profits going into the government with the idea that it would go to benefit the people. And there would also be programs of land redistribution. So there would be reforms where land would be redistributed, as well as the development of public education and all kind of resting on the funds brought in through these government national industries such as oil. There are limits to this success. The PRI will claim great levels of success. However, there's a lot of people who are still struggling and suffering, and the social hierarchy doesn't really change. The other thing is that the PRI is going to be associated with corruption because if you're connected in with the PRI, you are going to end up getting hooked up in a way that somebody not connected to the party will not get hooked up. So you're going to get this corruption that follows and limits the success of the PRI's intervention in the economy. So when we look at this, these three approaches, whether it be the New Deal, the 5 year plan, or the nationalization by the PRI, all of them are proposing alternatives to capitalism. The United States, it's not like they arrested capitalists. The Soviet Union, they were hardcore. If you were going against the 5 year plan, then you were an enemy of the state. And Joseph Stalin had no problems eliminating enemies. And the PRI, they didn't exactly go after you, but they did practice elements of repression and corruption. So we see socialist communist answers to these problems, but we also see limitations to those answers. And if you take a look at the propaganda poster from Stalin, you see him driving the ship of the Soviet Union. And that's a great example of what Stalin saw the role of government to be, to steer them forward into a bright future. So, and the thing is, you could find posters of FDR leading the United States into recovery. In Mexico, the PRI leading Mexico into recovery or into better times. That's a very common theme. Now, another group is going to be the fascist response. Now, fascism is a political philosophy, and we'll get more into it in the next unit. But fascism basically says democracy has failed. The democratic approach to governing only produces arguments and doesn't allow us to grow forward, grow stronger, and move forward. We need to unify and get on the same page as a nation. So fascism preaches nationalism. Fascism basically says, the problem with democracy is there's too much arguing. There needs to be agreement, and that agreement should always be in the nation's interest. So fascism is going to be rooted in an authoritarian approach to governing. In other words, it's going to say dissension is a threat to our stability and our strength. But the other thing is that fascism rejects the communist answers. So fascism is built on anti communism, and I would even argue anti socialism. And we say anti communism for this period of time because the communist revolution was fresh in everybody's mind. Italy did not want to see a Bolshevik revolution in their country. Germany did not want to see a Bolshevik revolution in their country. Brazil doesn't want to see a Bolshevik revolution. So the fear that the communist revolution would come to name your country motivated a political formation called fascism. Italy is going to see its fascist leader in Mussolini. In 1922, Mussolini takes power in Italy, and he is going to put into practice an economic system called corporatism. You're going to want to underline this. And the idea is that corporatism says every industry, if you think about it this way, every industry has three parts to it. It has the employers, it has the workers who are usually together in a labor union at this time, and it has the state officials, the people regulating the industry. So those three groups in corporatism, they have to work together in the interest of the nation. In other words, those three are going to need to agree. Now, usually when we look at it, the employers, the unions, and the state officials usually are pulling on each other because all three of them have different self interest. The employers want more profit, the unions want more income or better conditions, and the state officials want more power. What corporatism says is your self interest is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the interest of the nation. And that's what's going to lead you to a totalitarian approach. So, in other words, the union will negotiate with the management, and then the government will step in and say, let us see the agreement. Okay, we accept this as your agreement. So, the government is going to be much more involved in the decisions of the economy. And the government is going to justify it as we're doing what's in the best interest of the nation. You know, to have workers strike is going to hurt the national economy. So we're not going to allow workers to strike. So we're going to go ahead and settle the issue for you. And that type of totalitarian approach is going to be very common in the fascist answer, which is we're going to enforce stability. And if you are disruptive, you'll be removed. So when we go to Germany and Hitler in 1933, so Mussolini's response is to the post World War I economic problems. Hitler's response, or the growth of Hitler, is in response to the Great Depression. So I don't want to get too much into Hitler's history, but the basic idea is that Hitler had been active. He had been active with the Nazi Party for a long time. Throughout the 1920s, the Nazi Party was responding to what they perceived as wrongs done to Germany because of World War I, because of the Versailles Treaty. So they had been competing for power. 1929, the economy drops out. And that's when the Nazis become popular. The Nazis say, we can fix this problem created by the Great Depression, and we can return Germany to his position of power that it's always been. So the Nazis create this appeal to the unemployed of Germany saying, we can protect you from the communist revolution that is surely to come, and we can lead Germany into a brighter future. That's what leads to the rise of the Nazis. And Hitler eventually becomes chancellor. And one of the things that Hitler will do is cancel the reparations. He will just simply say, we're not paying them anymore. And Britain and France really don't do anything to stop him. The other thing he does is he begins a series of deficit spending programs. The government starts spending on a remilitarization and infrastructure projects. The highway system of Germany, the Autobahn, is funded by these programs under the Nazis. So what happens is the Nazis are pumping money into the German economy. But here comes the totalitarian part of it, is that if you want to do business with the German government, you need to be part of the Nazi party. So what the Nazi party does is they eliminate all the other political parties. And if you want to do business with the Nazis, you have to be supportive and demonstrate your support of the Nazis. And that way the business part of Germany starts to fall under Nazi control. And we'll see how that plays out later. Finally, we go to Brazil. And in Brazil, there's going to be a man named Vargas who is going to emerge as a result of a coup. And Vargas, he takes over in 1930 and he promises industrialism. And he's supported by the urban middle class. The urban middle class wants to see industrialization, and they think the landowning class is holding everything back. So when Vargas takes power as president, he begins to implement a corporatist policy, very much like Mussolini. And what he's going to usher in is an industrial growth. Brazil is going to rapidly industrialize under the rules and regulations of Vargas. However, Vargas is also going to put out political suppression. Other political parties and political opponents are going to be silenced, and we'll get propaganda pictures like this one to the right. And I happen to write down the quote that you see, and it says, and this gives you an idea of the type of totalitarian approach. We need to react in time against the indifference towards the moral principles, against the habits of the lazy and parasitic intellectuals, against diverse tendencies, infiltrated by many ways in the young minds, responsible for the future of the nations. What he's saying is there are outside forces that are poisoning the young minds, and his part is the only thing that will stop it. So when you look at Hitler, Mussolini, and Vargas, all three of them, they don't assume control of the economy the way the Soviet Union does. They don't assume control the way Mexico does. They don't even have New Deal programs the way the United States has. What all three do is they take the business interests within their country and basically say, you need to get on the same page with me. We're going to strengthen our nation and you have to play ball. And then the second thing is they say, to protect this growth and to protect our independence and stop communism, we need to stay in power and eliminate the opposition. And this is going to lay the foundation for something that I think is very important today. The idea of a free market economy is appealing to a lot of people. They want the prosperity that often comes from a free market economy, but they don't want the arguments that democracy can often create. So what we're seeing with Hitler, Mussolini, and Vargas is an authoritarian free market society. And I know that sounds like a contradiction because it is. But when we look at China and Russia today, we see something very similar. So it's something to keep your eye on as we go through the rest of the 20th and into the 21st century. But that takes us to the end of this part of the lecture. So I will see you next time as we talk about political effects of the interwar years. Until then, take care.